Alright, I'm going to tie an epoxy buzzer, and I'm starting off with a size 10 scud hook, and I'm going to add some additional weight to this. So I'll take some wraps of lead wire, maybe just 10 turns or so, and I'll just trim off the excess there. And notice I'll leave a little bit of space here behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to be tying in some materials to the front of that. So the thread that I'm going to use is an 8/0, and this is an olive dun thread. So I'll just take a couple of wraps in front of my lead, and I'll reach all the way back and gather it up between the two thread dams, and then just take my wraps through the entirety of the lead. So now I have my thread back behind the lead, and I'm going to tie in my first material, and that I'm going to use a small ginger ultra wire, and I will just make a couple of wraps to lock that in. I'm not going to advance it all the way down. The next piece I'm going to take is going to be the main body color, and that I'm going to use a floss. And for this pattern, I'm going to use 2 strands of floss. It usually comes in 2 or 4 strand quantities. So I'll take 2 strands of my floss, and you can make these in a lot of different colors. A lot of different variations to the rib and to the body color. And I'll just tie that into the side. And I like to wet the tip of the floss when I'm doing 2 or more strands, just because they adhere together. Then for the other rib, in addition to the wire, I'm going to add floss, and you can tie this with just any darker floss material. In this case, I'm going to use a dark olive, and I'll tie that in behind there as well. Now I can gather all of this material, and I'm going to tie it all down together, and what that does is just gives you a slimmer profile. And then I'll just come back through and start to make just a slight transition between that lead and the body. And I'll take that to just beyond the point in the hook. Now I can start to wrap my material forward. So the first that I'm going to take front is the orange floss. And again, I'll just wet that slightly so that it's more manageable to work with. And the thread is going to show through just a little bit, but that's alright. It gives it some more depth and visual interest to the pattern. And once I have that to the thread, then I can tie it off. And then trim off the excess. And now I'll come through with my olive floss, and for this I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to wet it slightly, and then I'm going to make some turns in this so that it gets smaller in diameter. So then I'll just start to make my wraps all the way up through, and I give it a twist every time I turn, so that it keeps a uniform thickness. And when I get to the top, then I can tie that off as well. Then I can bring up my ginger ultra wire, and this will just add some depth to the pattern, especially when the epoxy is applied. And so I'm just following that olive floss all the way up through the pattern. and I'll bring it up to the front and tie it off as well. Now there's several materials that I'll tie into the front or the thorax of this fly. The first of which is going to be the wing case, and for that I'm going to use a pearl tinsel, and I'll just tie that in right on top. Make sure I have it good and centered in there. And then I'm also going to tie in the gills for this, and the gills that I'm going to use, I like to use my flash, and so I've just got some orange flash here. I'm going to take 2 strands, and I'm going to tie those strands into either side. Again, it makes it more manageable if you wet these together. And so I'll just take a rough trim to length, and I'll tie in the gills on the other side. Alright, now the main piece of thorax, I'm going to go back to my olive dubbing, and this time I'm going to take 2 strands just so that it gives me quicker coverage. And I'll tie that in to the front. And then finally, this has a shuck to it, and the shuck that I'll use is just an Antron yarn. And I'll take that right off the pack, and when I do it, I find it to be a little thick, so I'll just thin out some of those fibers, not quite in half. And then I'll tie that into the front. And then I can trim that. Alright, now I tied a ton of material here into the front of this fly. Now it's time to start wrapping it all together. So first, with the olive floss, I'll wrap that up to my thread. And tie that off. Then I'll take my gills and I'm just twisting them slightly so they lay almost on top of each other. And then when I make my wraps, I take it back and away from the eye, and then I can do the same thing on the other side. And then finally I can bring my wing case over top. Alright, now I can trim all of this off. If you're paranoid like me at times, I'll put in a whip finish there just so it doesn't all come running off. And then I'll pull up my shuck and start to make just a thread dam underneath so that shuck stands on top. And when I whip finish, I'll whip finish behind. and I can trim that off. And at this point, if you want to do any grooming and catch any of those errant shuck fibers that came through, you can. And now I'll start to apply my epoxy. And so the epoxy that I'm going to use for this is a Gorilla Glue. That's a 5-minute epoxy. And how I do this, I just take the cap off and I'll just put the 2-part epoxy into a spoon. And it doesn't take much to get that going. And then I'll take a toothpick and just mix the 2 parts of the epoxy together. And less is more with this application, so I'll just take my toothpick here, and you can use a bodkin if you like, but sometimes this epoxy is tougher on your equipment, so I'll just make sure that I've got it covered throughout. And then I've caught the threads. And that's it. It'll take 5 minutes to set up and a little bit longer to fully dry. You might see some air bubbles in it. Those will work themselves out as they dry. While it's getting set here, I'll often turn it upside down so it doesn't have that massive epoxy underneath. But nice little pattern. Again, you can tie it in a ton of variations. There's a lot of variables that you can change to make this your own. But that is the Hammer Creek epoxy buzzer.